Well, in general, each project is a different project, unless you're working on a product that is to be repeated, which of course I have. The first house, of course, was my first opportunity to do a house for myself, and it's a bit hard to appreciate that one could buy a block of land and build a house in that period when you're kind of sort of employed as an architect. So it was a great sort of opportunity thing. But one of the things which was happening was the Paddington experience, which started a year before. I had the land, but I hadn't designed the house. So it was actually designed at the same time as the first Paddington. So there was a clear sort of recognition that one's one-off and the others are not. So in a way, I think it helped the Paddington a lot, because I didn't attempt to do things which were, let's say, elaborate in them. I could do it the direct, simple way. In the house, I could elaborate it. And by elaboration, I don't mean making it fussy and expensive. I mean, in fact, I called it on that house sort of theme and variations, that you set up a framework which is like the rhythm of a musical piece, and the framework has got a repetition in it, and quite complex but three-dimensional, and then all the infills are different. So every time it's got one of these triangular spaces filled in and around every corner, the infill is particular to what's being looked out through it, or what appears to be from outside, and what its role is for ventilation or privacy or whatever. So it's got a very elaborate development of a theme in it, yet with very simple elements, which means it still costs money, and of course it'd take a little while to finish everything off and get it right. So it was a big step, and I was also designing the State Office block at the same time, and the Fisher Library was just being fitted out. So a lot of the detail that was being done in these high-style buildings, high-cost, high-quality buildings, could be assessed as to whether it was appropriate or whether it wasn't. So the Mosman house has the door furniture, bronze door furniture, which was specially developed for Fisher Library and State Office, and it had lots of other bits and pieces, but it was kind of like a working out of things. For example, I knew the Raymore people, and they were very keen because we were doing State Office block, and they brought out, it was Arthur Robinson, I think his name was, brought out the T4, the little sort of dome-shaped white cap on satin chrome, taps with a scoop out of the side. That was coming out, and the first production models were in the Mosman house, where we almost tested it there, and they finished up in Paddington 3 or 4 years later when they were more common, and it had lots of other things like that occurring in it. It had Paddington cupboards, so.
And you had the lovely idea of the garden terrace as the scheme.
Well, I think all the buildings I've done, I've either, I'm not sure whether you'd say, encountered or created or stumbled on the notion that there has to be a big idea. I think it's not universal in art that there needs to be a big idea, but it certainly helps. And it seemed to me to be something that was important. And I suppose what talent I had was for getting ideas. And then, of course, the problem is implementing them, as any artist has. So it had a big idea, and the big idea was that garden terraces. The site was relatively steep and triangular, and the contours ran diagonally on it. So it both stepped in plan and in section at the same time. And I suppose one of the other skills I had was a sort of three-dimensional geometry, understanding of the way things work around corners, which partly goes back to my interest in Mies van der Rohe. So that was a strong idea. To be very small. It was built in more difficult circumstances. We stumbled on a block of land. I had lost the other house to a sort of former phase of my life. And we found a block of land, which is unusual. And the challenge then, a very interesting one, was to do a townhouse. And I had, this of course was 1980, and I had been promoting initially with Paddington 7 and one of the other players from the Sunline Homes fallout, townhouse ideas, and I built several groups, including 3 where our professional practice was a part of the developing team. We owned the risk of building 3 groups of townhouses, which were very successful. One won an Institute Award, and they were successful design-wise, but not financially, and we all backed out of that at the point. But they were Paddington 7 things. That was in 1966 through about 74. So when I got an opportunity to do a townhouse, I was really interested in doing that way. And incidentally, the house at St Ives, the courtyard house that we've been looking at, was also a prototype for townhouses for Paddington 7, because it's a cluster house where you can join them together. So the big idea in Mosman was, in Paddington, if it was big, was that it would be built like a standard block of flats. It'd have concrete floors and brick walls and just load-bearing construction. So it doesn't have long spans and big windows or any of that stuff. It was an attempt to sort of use a kind of vernacular, what was then a kind of vernacular in building small residential buildings. And the other side of it was a kind of the notion of contextualism, the emergence of ideas about place and reference to earlier periods and to the existing context had been emerging for some years, and I was something of a sort of enthusiast for Robert Venturi's work, not to do similar, but to understand what it was about. And there was also some influence from Christopher Alexander, I think it is, who was talking about the language of building. And so it drew the Paddington house. First of all, it was a 6-metre wide townhouse. It had a unique configuration because of the slope and having to build right on the street and so on, but that's part of the game. But in terms of reference, it played a sort of street role about the security of space, the hierarchy of public to semi-public to private, and the sort of barrier, but from which you looked out and supervised the street and so on. And in devising that kind of screen wall at the beginning, penetrated by garage and by walk entrance and by a round window. The round window came from the hotel on the corner of on Glenmore Road at Five Ways. Looking at it from the other side, I was always interested in the vernacular of the back of terrace houses, particularly with the informal parts of them, the way the tunnel backs were done, usually monopitched and with a big kitchen chimney, usually with just corbelled out overhangs, instead of the classic chimney on the ridge, which is a most common feature of terrace houses. So I made the other side of the house look like the back of a terrace house in some ways. So tall and thin, monopitched, and big chimney and slightly overscaled chimney and so on. So it had a lot of those ideas about what I suppose people categorise as sort of postmodern views, but always been a contested idea from my point of view. Nevertheless, it was of its time. The Palm Beach site was really a monster. It had been, it had one creek running across it and another vigorous creek running down one side with a major waterfall. And it was in a slip area, and the part of the land in which you could build was very, very limited. And fairly early in the piece, I concluded it had to be a little tower rather than a long house. And so it started small in plan and developed from there. It had a couple of strong ideas in it, I suppose. One was that to be in a sort of an evocation of the glassed-in veranda, the traditional glassed-in veranda that I'd spent a lot of time in my childhood in, various relatives had them. But what I felt was interesting about glass-in verandas is that you couldn't combine them with a balcony. So I put the balcony beside the house instead, and partly behind it, rather than in front of the room. And I think that was a fairly sort of positive sort of move. Well, Palm Beach was built in 1985, that area, as a house, both as a weekender and potentially a kind of retirement house. As it turned out, it wouldn't have been suitable for the kind of retirement I've had, which is busier than when I was practicing, but because there are more diverse activities. But that was the aim. So it was very casual, but it was arranged so that it had a kind of cellular rooms on the entrance level, the lowest level, which themselves were sort of perched up on a framework to deal with the slope. And they were enclosed with the weatherboards, and they had this canite lining and relatively small windows with shutters, and you could darken them. You could have an afternoon nap there, and they were quite small rooms. Everything was small, and the bathroom was, our bathroom was a bit like a bathroom on a yacht. The other thing I used to do was race yachts in the 70s, another influence on me. mad activities. It was like a yacht. It had a wood deck floor, water goes through, and tiny, and then the room was the top floor, which was glass all round, and it was a big glassed-in veranda with a high ceiling, and a loft, as you remember, look down over it. And it had a window seat right around, and a table which I designed, and alto chairs, and this sort of fairly simple kitchen. A lot of the cooking was done outside on a barbecue and under the sala, in the sala. The notion of the sala was a lot to do with my experience in the Southeast Asia. You know, I did the embassy in Bangkok in 1973 through 76, and got to love that kind of outdoor room with tropical foliage and things. And Palm Beach did it again, really repeated it. Lots of air and shade and coolness when you wanted it. So that room was really what it was all about on the top of it, and then and very much related to the landscape, which is one of its merits is that the landscape itself was tangible. You know, there was a rock face there, you know, and trees and things. You weren't just perched up in the air with an ocean view, different sort of thing. So that makes it much more intimate, and it deals with much wider amount of mood and activity. So, and talking about Palm Beach, if you treat it as it's a recreational building to a degree. It's like living on a boat or in a tent or in a hut somewhere. The best weekenders, I think, have that sort of character. So there's a sort of game, in a sense, the game of changing your rules about personal space and privacy, yet still having places you can get away, but not the way that you lay a living house out where, you know, you try to zone it and not cross one to get to the other. So part of the game is spatial variation, and having a loft in which would overlook the main room, given the room is very high, and given the idea of the house being a staircase to get up the cliff, you then went up to the loft, and the loft then opened onto a bridge which led back onto the top of the cliff. You know, there was a sort of game there that was worth exploiting. And the joke we used to make was that we figured that the grandchildren would live up there most of the time, but in fact it was the children who took over the loft most often, and grandchildren were sent to the little rooms down below. The children by then being in their 40s, you know. Yeah, one uses the rock wall and the back wall of the house as a kind of courtyard with a beautiful lichen-covered wall, and where the sun comes in as well, so it's a little trap. And the other one's a sala. It's an outdoor room with a big roof and, you know, dining table and barbecue and all that stuff. And then you can go up a couple of steps and another terrace which has a view, a big view, and again sun, and it's got trees overhanging it, and so there's three different characters. And when you count the room, the multi-use room, as another kind of living space, you've got sort of four choices of where you relax. Yeah. It's a puzzle, you know. I think puzzle solving is part of what architects do, I think. The question is assembling the questions so that you don't have distraction into the wrong puzzle, you know. You've got to ask yourself the right question. Well, the house became a sort of staircase up the hill. It's actually quite difficult to get up to the high level. So you go into the house and you kind of wend your way up and back onto the top of the hill. And there's beautiful bushland up there. Well, it wasn't when we started, but It grows back if you keep the weeds out. It was all lantana. In fact, when we bought the land, you couldn't fully inspect it because it had 3 metre high lantana from the street to the back boundary. And we explored it with machetes, you know. Well, the Palm Beach house has a later version of the sort of canite wall linings that Harry Rembert's had. It's called low density. Well, when that was built, it was called low density fibreboard, and it's a bit like, it's sort of, you know what it is.
Like a corky.
It's a bit like cork.
Yeah.
Oh, it's fibrous.
Yes.
And it's golden coloured. It's wood chip coloured. It's basically wood chips compressed and made to adhere. And it used to be made from cane fibre years ago and known as canite. And it was made in Scandinavia and shipped around that way too in pre-war. And Harry's house used that. And also on the outside of Harry Rembert's house was fence palings, which he used to buy at the local fence timber yard. And in those days they were somewhat better quality than they are now, probably better quality than our select grade hardwood weatherboards. But you could just buy it for dirt cheap. And much of the building was done by Harry himself anyhow, and they were just lapped vertically and nailed with a galvanised nail. And they're still there. I was up there at Peter Webber owns it now, and I was up there only 4 years ago. No, I think I'm always, I try to expose how it's made as first preference everywhere. In some cases you can't really do it with any economy or sense. And then the question is how do you place finishes so that they're finishes rather than something solid. The problem with all things, structure or finish, is that all you can see is the surface. And so the structure is only implied by its shape anyhow, and some kind of lesson from the surface. But the Mosman house is just as simple as the Palm Beach one. In fact, they've got a lot of similarities, including using bronze nails for the boards and the tallow wood boards, the Palm Beach's tallow wood boards, softwood frame, and many aspects of the detailing. Well, I think one of the things that is appropriate in a weekender is humour, light-heartedness, and sort of visual jokes almost, recalling something and say, well, that's like an old meat safe, isn't it? Ha ha, But in fact, when you think about it, of course that helps you cement the idea to do it. The cupboards are left unused for weeks at a time, and you need to ventilate them. So the perforated brass fronts are actually quite sensible, and even the open shelves, because even they will of course collect some dust, but you can at least see where everything is, and it's ventilated. I think what tends to happen is you accumulate a whole lot of sort of images and things that you remember and like for some reason, and then they sort of come up. That stair is, in some respects, is not unlike the very steep stairs you find in a Le Corbusier two-storey apartment. The split-level ones in the Unité or in some of his influenced people's like Atelier 5. These are very, short, steep, getting up on quickly into a loft, and they sort of come back and you remember that. Yeah, it's a much more confident house than say the Mosman House. Mosman House is a more original house in its context, probably. But the other one has got the benefit of more of a life and judgment and so on. Well, the Mosman House was designed in, I suppose the design, strictly speaking, was 1961. And it was built in 62 and won the 63, won the 62 award, but it came out in 63. They were 1 year skipped at that point, which is the same year that Fisher won the Sulman. And I was kind of thrust into undeserved prominence. Yes, and it, I'd had to save up for it, and bought the land actually with the prize money from the Cherrybrook, from the Tormans house, the Women's Weekly Tormans house competition. Well, it was a huge prize. Yeah. Michael and I, of course, shared it, and it was £2,000. Yes. Which is probably about $40,000 or $50,000 in today's money. Oh. Must be something like that. In 1950, it's more than 10 times. Yes. And of course, land wasn't as expensive then. Yeah, it was a huge boost, and I got the deposit on the land and a car out of it, and Michael got a car and some good living out of it, I think. Well, I've always been involved in drawing, right back to when your parents like you to draw things, little gifts. My mother was something of an amateur artist and quite a fine draftsman and watercolourist, and encouraged me. And she sent me to East Sydney Tech, the old jail art school, for schoolboy classes, which they ran in during the later years of the war and just after. And so I had some kind of formal training there. And then I went to the university. Well, I tried to study art at school, but it was Sydney Boys High School, and you could only do the curriculum subjects, which was all very well, and they were very good, but you couldn't do art. And you couldn't do any sport other than team sport, so neither of which suited me. So I then did a correspondence course towards the end of the school when I was too old for East Sydney. And then I got to university, and of course that was the beginning of my life. A couple of people we knew who had some connection with it. And one of them knew Cobden Parkes, the government architect, and sort of took me along and introduced me, and he encouraged me to apply for a traineeship, which I got. It was of low prestige if you worked in the government. When I was a university student, it was a paying era. I was being paid for by traineeship. Peter Webber was the year ahead of me. Peter Hall was 2 years behind me. And so was Michael Dosart, 2 years behind me. So we all did this sort of traineeship thing, and the other students, of course, were paying fees and had nice things like motor cars, But when it became known that working in the government architect's office was actually quite good, and we were being given really interesting work to do, then there was a queue for it, and it blossomed, the office itself blossomed from the demand for doing their course. Won the Byron Hadley, which was the only travelling scholarship in those days, which bought me a return ship fare to Britain, Europe, and a small amount left over. So what with savings and working in London I was away for 18 months on that and toured Europe. It was a great time. Le Corbusier was building some of his greatest buildings. Ronchamp was brand new when I saw it. The Joules houses in Paris, I was shown through by the owners who were proud to have them. See a student outside actually interested in their house. We went to Finland and saw Alto's works, stayed in an Alto dorm, and it was fantastic. Saint Sala was just finished a couple of years before. When I came back, my father subsidised the return journey by flying me back through America. So I had sort of half my sea voyage, but could put it to the other. So I flew back through America and saw the latest Mies van der Rohe buildings. I went up onto the top scaffolds of the Seagram building when they were assembling the bronze cladding in 1957. Saarinen had just built the Kreisky Auditorium, and that's the triangular one, and the Opera House competition had just come out. And there was Minoru Yamasaki was a very influential architect there, and Edward Dorrell Stone, and Wright, of course. I went deliberately to see Wright buildings, and it was fantastic. All those great people were still working. Mm. Yes, for that. So it was the end of my fourth year. I had one of those sort of scholarship thing, prize or something, I went to Melbourne and met Neil Clarahan, and he introduced me to Robin Boyd and all those, and John Phyllis Murphy and Kevin Ball and so on. And they were working on the Olympic swimming pool thing. That was 1953, early 54, late 53. And they all generously took us around the work and so on. And Roy Crowns, of course, too. But I think that period of modern architecture in Australia was at its best at that time in Melbourne. Sydney was potentially going to be better, I think. I think they were still philosophically, intellectually in a mainstream modernist era. Sydney, you had the arch exponent of mainstream modernism with Harry Seidler, who was building houses only at that point. Not many either, he'd built one or two. Arthur Baldwinson, who was building the sort of classical modern house, and Anchor, who were, again, the same. So there wasn't a lot here that was significantly different to Melbourne or better, but there were some differences. Melbourne tended to be lighter, a little bit more structural expression. Sydney's tended to sit on the ground more firmly, except for Seidler, who tended to float off the ground without wanting to rest on it. So there was some quite interesting sort of student dialogue about which way are things going. And I didn't have to resolve that very much in that period, but and the student work I was doing was because I was to the end of the course I was doing larger scale building designs, and that was all domestic. There was very little happening in large scale buildings here until the year that my last year and as I graduated, where the government architect got the chemistry school at Sydney University, and I was then 21, and Peter Webber and I designed it with Harry Rembert, and I got the first autonomous building that is totally responsible for is the St Margaret's Chapel in 1955, before I'd gone to Europe. and I detailed it by aerogram from Europe. It was being documented back here under Peter Hall's control by a private firm, and Harry Rembert and I exchanged aerograms, almost daily, constant flow of blue paper going backwards and forwards. And
it's a really beautiful
so it got a lot of
building,
things that I was already seeing in Europe,
yes.
like Matisse's Chapel at Vence and some of the alto influence that was coming. And also it was actually an expression of my interest in structural expression that I was doing in my university designs the last year and so, and it's exactly like some of the work I was doing at the university, the way it's structured is expressed. Yeah, it was sort of accidental, wasn't it? When Michael and I won that competition, was just, let's do the competition, we won it. We entered a lot of other competitions, didn't win them while we were in the government. And it sort of just sat there. We got the money and sat there for a couple of years, and then a estate agent decided he'd like to build it at Cherrybrook, and that got the attention of Lend-Lease. And Sunline, I was involved in Sunline because I knew Brian Pettit and the Lend-Lease guy, Max Bowen, and it's a long story. So somehow, in parallel, there was the beginning of a sort of domestic practice was happening without having sought it. And it got to a dilemma at one point because suddenly Paddington Sever took off in 1963, and it was really either I had to drop them or I had to set out. Well, I got those two big awards and I was kind of sort of public, and so I went into practice, and basically on the strength of the Paddington Sever, although once it was known, I was offered the student union at Newcastle by the students because I'd done Fisher. And Bryce Mortlock then offered me a partnership, so I went straight into partnership, in effect taking up Anchor's retirement. And Bryce had all the work at Sydney University in the Darlington precinct, and so I, not entirely reluctantly, it's total misrepresentation. I very enthusiastically seized the moment of having become well known, having some awards and having the opportunity of an income from the Paddington Sever and then from the practice of Anchor Mortlock, Murray and Woolley. They were, what did they call them, upwardly mobile young professionals or something like that? Is that the word?
Yuppies?
Yuppies. Young, upwardly mobile professionals, that's right. Mostly. Not always. They were people who would have liked to get an architect-designed house and then either tried and it was too expensive, or they could see that it wasn't going to work out, and they came that way. There was also the emergence of the product system, that is project housing. It really didn't exist before about 55, 6, somewhere there. Well, not even then, probably. The Sunline effort was from 1959, 60, 61. They went broke in 60, I think, 61. And Michael and I had actually done a couple of sketches for them. And their people all dispersed. One group became Paddington Sever, another group became Lend-Lease Homes, and others went into other fields. So that's really the beginning of project housing. And although Robin Boyd had done a little bit of it in Melbourne, it wasn't very much. It hadn't really been commercial. It wasn't until we'd established that Paddington Sever established the sort of architect design, good quality, very economical house thing market by about late '64, after I'd gone into practice, that merchant builders set up in Melbourne with Robin Boyd's old client, David Yenkin. He built the Black Dolphin Hotel, down the south coast, and Yenkin got Graham Gunn and did those houses. The main thing that Melbourne had done very sensibly for a long time was the architect's home service, the age home service, which Neil Clarihan ran, which started by Robin Boyd. And Neil Clarihan ran that and did a lot of private houses of his own. And that's why I got him as because I knew him, got him as our agent there when we expanded into Melbourne in '66, I think it was. '66, somewhere there, '67. Well, Paddington started off with one design. After about a year, it was 2 designs. After 4 years, there were probably 15, and we're up into the 20s eventually. And each of the models that were created originally went through a product development phase, which we gave a alphabetic. So we're up to, I think, H or I or J or somewhere. On some of the earlier models. Every year or every 2 years they got upgraded. And partly for marketing reasons, there was also a rather stressful need to get another look out, another product that doesn't look like all of the others, So you kind of work through all the little edges of the thing, whereas the big sort of main, most sensible, most logic house just kept going all the way through to product J. So of the 3,000 or 4,000 houses we built, probably 1,500 of them were the low line in its various guises of different roofs and things. But it also had so there were a lot of models, and we built a lot of houses. And there were spin-offs from it. The Housing Commission got the firm then, Zanker Model, Murray Woolley, to do government housing. We built quite a few hundred. And in Canberra, I did a review in 1970, I think it was, of all the government housing in Canberra and detached housing, and then produced models in response to that. And we built prototypes, and Paddington 7 actually built a lot of them, and other builders. So there's 600 houses in Canberra that were really developments from Paddington 7 into government housing at a pared down, you might say, a pared down style. It was vulnerable to, like all products, to copying at the same time as downgrading. So the combination of quality diminution, less aesthetic rigour, the assumption and correct assumption that some people wouldn't notice anyhow, so that there was a kind of dilution of the market. That didn't make Paddington 7 still stayed at the top of the market, and there were a couple of others, Habitat that Michael Dosar did, and Civic that Melbourne architect someone forgotten. Did. They were vigorous and good, but there were a lot of other things. That's one thing. But the other one was the land ran out. The thing I've said all along about housing is that the house is only one of the factors. The locality is just as important, if not more. And the locality brings with it all sorts of issues like recreation facilities, pleasant living, social placement, approval of your peers, schools, work, transport, all that stuff is part of housing. The house is just one element there. So if you take away some of those factors from the choice of people who otherwise might like your house, then you're not going to sell the house. So the land ran out at St Ives, it ran out at Castle Hill, it was getting out towards Penrith. In the south it ran out once you got to the national park. You know, in northeast we did a lot on the peninsula, but that ran out enough to mean that it just wasn't viable. And by then, of course, we were building all over Australia, and we had franchises and other things, and they tried franchising for a while. But Pettit and Sevitt, the people, had sold their interest to a public company which had other interests as well and went broke for the other interests, which meant that Pettit and Sevitt went broke. I did 100 houses in Fiji at a resort, which were built, never got paid for them, because when Pettit and Sevitt went, the parent company went into liquidation here, they foreclosed in Fiji and just took them. So well, their marketing, it's very, very difficult. It's hard to say hard to predict whether it, until we had the product and tried advertising, and a lot of interest, but until you get down to it, it didn't happen. And then one of the old players of the early Pettit and Sevitt days, Dick Chadwick, funded a prototype. So we built a prototype, which is invaluable, and it, you know, we could re-establish whatever was appropriate of the look, which surprisingly was very similar to what it was before. When you went through the same process, it looked very much like it. So in a way, it was a sort of unstylistic exercise, which is good. And there's a good builder who can build it, and so on. But so then it was marketed, well, you know, we're ready, and you can do it. But several years have gone by and we still haven't got one going. It's partly the land problem again. It's partly that the new land is being developed as what the Americans call tract housing. That is, the house and land go together, or you have the option to buy the land and wait and then get the house. But you're really tied into that product. Whereas the tradition in the 60s through to the 80s was that you bought your block of land, you paid it off, then you went along to the bank and you had your equity, and the bank would lend you money, these, so with the insurance company. Now it's sort of lend you 100% without anything. So we're building a sort of American crash if we're not careful. So the Pettit and Sevitt is limited to people who actually have a block of land, whether it's a knockdown or whatever, but they've got to have it, and that's quite a big chunk of it. And so far, and the other thing it's inhibiting is the bushfire regulations. A lot of the land that you can get where you've got the choice of which house you build is caught up in bushfire proximity. The land that the developers are doing, house and land, is not, it's all old farming land with no trees, with very few trees. And it's very difficult. You couldn't get land with those sorts of people with enough taste and money and incentive and where they want to educate their children and all the rest of it, were not able to get land where it had that. So they went into renovations and they started coming. That's why Paddington boomed again as a living place, and the Federation style became sort of rather overvalued, and the bungalow style eventually, everyone put great big living rooms on the back of bungalow style houses. Well, as I said earlier, the Pettit and Sevitt really went out of business by companies that had acquired them, gradually winding down and out of loss of land, whatever, all that stuff. So that and the rest of the project housing market kind of disappeared for a long time in favour of renovations. Then it started to come back in the form of what we call McMansions now, as you know, not for Pettit and Sevitt. So they'd all gone off into other things. Ron had passed away, and Brian had gone into other things. I used to do a lot of work with him after Pettit and Sevitt. And almost by chance, I think it must have been about 2002, Val came across the fact that the Paddington name had lapsed because it had been flicked on as part of the assets of a whole chain of broke companies, most of them land developers and speculators of various kinds, who took each other over. And the name was caught up in all that, and finally it lapsed. And so she picked it up and came back to me, I think it was either in the late 90s or early 2000s, and said, look, I've got the name back, and Val's a real dynamic, and you know, for the interests of their children, and Brian didn't want to do it. He had fully retired by then. So she set out to do it, and I speculated the early ideas of how one might do it. We developed new designs and developed some of the old designs, see how they work. And it sort of tended to drag on because essentially it wasn't really a business until it's a business, you know. And then it got a bit of impetus from an opportunity to build a prototype by Dick Chadwick, who used to be the roofer of the Paddington Sebbits in 1963. So that's how it all started up again.